in 1 Corinthians 9 tonight. 9, and we'll go through verse 1 through 12 of 1 Corinthians 9. Paul writes, "Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are not you my workmanship in the Lord? If to others I am not an apostle, at least I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. This is my defense to those who would examine me. Do we not have the right to eat and drink? Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating of its fruit? Who tends a flock without getting some of the milk? Do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. Is it for oxen that God is concerned? Does he not certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope, and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. If we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share this rightful claim on you, do not we even more so? Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ." Now, this chapter seems like a little bit of a shift going from chapter 8. In chapter 8, Paul wrote about eating meat sacrificed to idols and how some Christians could eat that meat and not be bothered by it. Other Christians had previous association with it, with idolatry, and felt very uncomfortable with eating that meat. And Paul made that differentiation between the two parties, those who could and those who couldn't. And he called those who could the strong, while those who couldn't he called the weak. And this title he gave them because of their conscience. That's what he said, that their conscience, who could eat, was more developed, and they had knowledge, and they knew that there was nothing associated necessarily with that sacrificial meat. There was nothing that you were given to the idol. There's no worship that you're giving to any other god, that it's okay to eat that meat in the marketplace. One was more developed, one had more knowledge, and they had found that it was fine to eat meat sacrificed to an idol. Whereas the weaker had a conscience that was less developed. The weaker was someone who couldn't go to the local marketplace and partake of the meat and be fine with it in their conscience. They would have to abuse their conscience while going through this process. It was less developed, it wasn't as quite refined, and it had more ignorance. And ignorance may sound like a strong word, but it just means without knowledge. They just didn't have the knowledge for themselves to know that this was separated from the idol and its power. So they didn't feel comfortable eating the same meat that other Christians could. And while Paul made these distinctions, he gave preference to those with the weaker conscience. He didn't give preference to those with the stronger conscience, which may seem odd because he just called one stronger and one weaker. But he said the stronger has a greater level of obligation. The stronger has another level of responsibility to those who are weaker, to those Christians who couldn't eat. He said to pay attention to the weaker brother, because Christ came not to please himself. Christ came for the satisfaction of us. Christ came to redeem us. Christ came not as a king to be served, but himself as a servant here on the earth. And he told his Christian brothers and sisters to be mindful of those who were weaker, to lay aside certain freedoms while they were in their presence out of love. This would have been hard for them to accept, because why do I have to lay aside my freedom, my use of these things for someone else? Why should I care about someone else that much? And Paul said, while they were in your presence and you knew that they had a problem with this, to lay aside, because it's not worth it. It's not worth causing them to have a stumbling block and causing them to abuse their conscience. And perhaps they were planning on eating more of this meat and partaking of it, and maybe they were even flaunting it. Going to the idol temple or the marketplace, having their Christian brothers and sisters over and saying, well, this was sacrificed to idols, and then just kind of flaunting their freedom in front of their other brothers and sisters. Keeping this in mind, it does make chapter 9 quite more applicable, though, to the situation that Paul's addressing. Because Paul's going to list several specific ways in which him himself, as an apostle, has laid aside certain of his rights. Because they could go around and the Corinthians can say, so Paul, if we're called to do this, what areas have you done this in? You're calling us to do this. What makes you so special to call us to do this? Paul is going to list several specific ways in which he, as an apostle of Christ, has laid down some of his own rights and some of his own freedoms. So Paul first affirms his apostleship, tells the Corinthians that they are living proof that he is an apostle. He could have many ways of calling attention to other churches or to others' credentials, but he says that you are the proof that I am an apostle in verses 1 and 2. An apostle usually does groundbreaking work in church planting. Some water, some plant. That list that he mentions, Apollos watered, I planted, Cephas did this other person did this. It's a team effort in ministry. The Corinthian church was proof that he was called to be an apostle because it was fruitful. It wasn't fruitful in the way some people may have wanted it to be, as there wasn't seeming to be much success right off the bat because, look at all the... 1 Corinthians is jam-packed with Paul just reproving them and showing them that they can't do this stuff. Then Paul states in the form of rhetorical questions that he was right to get his living from those who are spiritually benefiting from his ministry, just as they have a right to eat, to drink, and to also take a believing wife. He says we have a right to take of all of these things. Don't we also have a right to those who are spiritually benefiting to request funds from them? As they're putting their lives on the line for the sake of the gospel and for the church of Christ, Paul says that he himself and some of his fellow apostles have the right to request funds from the church. And in verse 7, he gives 3 examples. He gives the example of a soldier who serves by the military's expense, right? If you're a soldier, you're not told you have to provide all of this stuff for yourself, and this is the only way. That militarily, they provide that stuff for you to be able to go to war. Otherwise, who would enlist like that? The second one is a farmer who enjoys the fruit from his vineyard. A farmer has the rejoicing of enjoying all of the fruit and the hard sweat, tears, and blood that came about through all of his work. And then third, he mentions a shepherd who enjoys milk from the herd that he tends. And he uses those 3 examples to show that no one puts those people down for enjoying that. You've worked all season long as a farmer to produce the fruit that's being produced from the ground. And a soldier goes at the military's expense. A shepherd enjoys milk from his herd. And there's something that is God-given in that. In putting a lot of your heart into something and seeing the fruit that produces from that, Paul is saying that reasoning that's there is godly reasoning. Isn't that great to enjoy something after we've put our hand to the plow, after we've worked so hard and tireless over something, to see fruit produced from it? Paul says that's common reasoning to state that all those who have blood, sweat, and tears in their job, they get to receive benefit from their labor. This logic is not out of the ordinary. You work hard, you get to benefit from your labor. It's not a fallen mindset. It's the mindset that God gave us. We think that, I've heard it said that work is one of the punishments that Adam received whenever sin entered into the world, whenever the fall. But it wasn't work as he said, because he told Adam that by the sweat of your brow, that's when you're going to have to get your labor from, by the sweat of your brow. He told him that his punishment wasn't that he had to work for it because he was already a gardener. He's already tilling the land. He was already working and cultivating the land. His punishment was that you will work, and you may not necessarily see fruit from it. It's going to be by the sweat of your brow. It's going to be painful. It's going to be excruciating. And that was the punishment side of it. But the God-given side is that we work into something and that we want to see results. That's why frustration happens. That's why discouragement, despair sets in if we put so much into something and we just don't see the fruit from it. And the discouragement is natural. The despair is natural. Paul repeats this thought by telling them that this is not man's idea, but God's idea in verse 8, that the Lord tells him, that the law tells you this. You shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. Is it for oxen that God is concerned? So here he quotes Deuteronomy 25:4 to use vocational ethics. That's an interesting place to quote from. He says, you don't muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain, or you don't punish it while it's doing the work that it should be doing. He equates this line of reasoning to show the Corinthians that he and the rest of the workers of the gospel are totally within their God-given rights, and calling them to reap the material things from the Corinthians, which is funds. So in the background, what's going on, Paul is telling the Corinthians that he has every right as an apostle to request that they help fund his ministry because of what he's doing as a church planner, because he's what he's doing as an apostle. However, as we'll continue to read on, Paul doesn't take up that right. Interestingly enough, Paul says that he puts it aside, and he uses strong language even at that by saying that the Lord commands that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. But yet Paul doesn't do that, at least not in all situations. Going on from verse 13, he says, "Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? In the same way, the Lord commanded those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. But I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision. For I'd rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting. For necessity is laid upon me, woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I did this of my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, I am entrusted with a stewardship. What then is my reward? That in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel." Paul says, I took aside that right that I had. I had every right to take funds from the Corinthians, but he said when they offered that, when they extenuated that, he declined it. He didn't take his funds from the Corinthians. Now, if taken all three of those examples that he just gave, if in joining the military, you sign up and you say, I'll do all of this at my own expense. If you're a farmer and you say that you're not so much concerned about reaping the harvest, I'm not going to enjoy the fruit that all my hard work has produced. Or if the herdsman says, I'm not going to partake of the milk from the sheep that I've tended. That seems kind of backwards. And before we touch on the latter part of verse 12, we have to look at his continued examples. He continues this thought that he began in verse 7 by using those examples of a soldier, a farmer, and a shepherd. But this time he uses cultic examples. This time he extends a little bit and says that don't those who work in the temple have a right to partake of the sacrifices? Now he's referring to the Levitical priests and the rights that they had. Leviticus chapter 6, verse 16. I'm going to read. I know how much everyone, don't you just love Leviticus? I mean, it's just a great devotional reading. I actually really like Leviticus. I'm weird like that. But Leviticus chapter 6, verse 16. This is the words of the grain offering. "And the rest of it Aaron and his sons shall eat. It shall be eaten unleavened in a holy place. In the court of the tent of meeting they shall eat it." So that was of the grain offering. When the people offered it, the Aaron and his sons and the Levites, they could partake of the grain offering. The sin offering, Leviticus 6:26, says the priest who offers it for sin shall eat it. In a holy place it shall be eaten in the court of the tent of meeting. That's another offering that they could eat of it. The guilt offering, Leviticus 7, verse 6, says every male among the priests may eat of it. It shall be eaten in the holy place. It is most holy. So the Levites had the right to, when the people offered this, whatever wasn't burned up, whatever wasn't consumed, and whatever was worthy to be eaten, could be eaten by the priest because they didn't have the natural allotment that the other tribes got. The other 11 tribes got certain allotments of their property. But the Levites, God was said that your possession will be myself. I will be your possession. I will be your inheritance. Whereas all the other tribes, they have inheritance plotted out. That doesn't mean they couldn't own land, but it means that they didn't have the specific land like Manasseh and Gad and the other lands that they had. Levites just interspersed throughout the entire area, all the tribes. So Paul used that, makes an equation with the gospel ministry and with those who serve at the temple. That was their right to partake of the grain, the sin, the guilt offering, and every other offering that the Lord had said that they could partake of. So going back to verse 12b, Paul writes that we nevertheless did not use this right among you. Paul said that we had every right to, by logic, by reason. The Lord commands it, but we didn't do it. We forsook that opportunity. So, and continuing what he just said in chapter 8, those Christians were called to partake of not using their freedom to abuse others. And Paul says, if you want to look at me and what I've done, I have not taken from you Corinthians. I had every right to, but I didn't do it. Now he does receive support from other churches during this time. And he also supplements his income from being a tent maker. And in 2 Corinthians, so he doesn't deal with this so much in 1 Corinthians, but in 2 Corinthians, it becomes a big issue. Because the people who come in to the Corinthian church by the time of 2 Corinthians say that Paul is not really, the saying, you get what you pay for. Well, they were saying that, well, since you get what you pay for, Paul didn't really take any funds from you, so what kind of ministry were you receiving from him? They came in, and they supposedly had these extra credentials, and they could come in, and they received large sums from the Corinthians, just massive amounts of money. And it's interesting, you really know you're in a bad situation where not only do you have an abuser, but you have an abuser making you think that it's right. And they were making the Corinthians thinking that it was right for them to do this. You get what you paid for. Paul, he came, he didn't take any of your funds, so therefore he couldn't be that invested in your ministry. We're here, we're taking a lot from you, so that shows how invested we are. Paul said in 2 Corinthians 11, verses 8 and 9, he uses this strong language of robbed. I robbed other churches. Uses that exaggeration, hyperbole. I robbed other churches by accepting support from them in order to serve you. And when I was with you and was in need, I did not burden anyone, for the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my need. So I refrained and will refrain from burdening you in any way. While he was in Corinth, he didn't receive any funds from the Corinthians, but he received funds from the Macedonians. The churches in Macedonia consist of Philippi, Thessalonica, and Berea. And all three of those areas are poverty-stricken. Paul says, I don't receive funds from you, a metropolis, but I receive funds from a poverty-stricken area. Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea. That's why he uses so much, the two letters that we have from those, or well, I guess three, two from Thessalonians and one in Philippians. That's why Paul uses so much language of servanthood, being in jail, being in poverty, because they would know quite well what that means. And in Berea. But he tells the Corinthians that while I was here, they were in an extreme state of poverty, and he actually says that they begged to help me and to help the other ministries that we were a part of. And Paul let them. But during the Corinthians, he didn't take funds from them. But in the context of Corinthians, he says that he did not take hold of this right because, in his words, he didn't want to put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. How could accepting funds from that church in Corinth put such an obstacle in the way of his gospel ministry? Maybe some of you would have better answers to this, but some of the members of the Corinthian community were very wealthy. And so if he would take funds from them, he could get rich really quick. He could be a well-funded apostle and then be gone, just like the people of 2 Corinthians. They came in, they told the Corinthians that you have to pay us pretty well for us to be invested in your ministry. They did, and they fled after they pretty much rebuked Paul and everything that he stood for. We see this come up in chapter 11 when Paul writes about their conduct of the Lord's Supper. He says there's such a stratification, there's such a distinction in classes of people. One is poor, one comes late, one is rich, and one's probably hosting the Lord's Supper, and one's receiving all of the goods from all the things that they brought. And Paul rebukes them because of using their class distinctions like that. But here he uses the example of poverty of the Macedonian churches to stir a fire within them. And he said, if the Macedonian churches can give so greatly to the Jerusalem Christians, surely there's something, Corinthians, that you can give. So I don't think Paul took funds from them directly because he didn't want to seem as though he was getting rich quick scheme. I don't think he wanted to seem as though this was something that he could be there for a little while and then get a large amount of funds and then just leave. And so to prevent from making any obstacle, making any appearance of evil, Paul simply didn't accept that. Now, and this isn't a rhetorical question, can anybody think of any other reason why Paul said that this might have been an obstacle to take funds from that church while he's there, even though he had the right to?
Because people that have money tend to think that they can pay or buy their way through. The rich man came to Jesus and said, I'm going to buy, or we came and wanted to buy his way. He said, you can't use that money there's no way to buy your way to heaven.
Yeah.
But I think in the aspect that these others did receive money from them, they were just speaking what they wanted to hear. And that's one way they could go ahead and leave and come and go and get the money because they were doing basically business. But Paul said, this here, what I have to offer is not anything you can pay for. This is free.
Yeah.
And I think Paul, that was kind of his mindset also, was that this isn't something you can buy. This is something that's free, and you either accept it or you don't.
Mm-hmm.
And I come here so that you can't say that you paid a price for something, that you can't buy this.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think that's probably why he primarily stayed that way. And the other thing was, he spoke a lot of times about if you had a lot of money, it was easier to, to be distracted whenever you have money, and he wasn't there for money, he was there for a purpose.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Maybe they felt as though they could have manipulated him a little bit if they received it. Yeah.
Wouldn't not taking the money be an example of trusting God to provide?
Yeah.
That also,
yeah. He was kind of showing them by example how to live. Because some of the pretty wealthy members of the Corinthian church may not know what that lifestyle was like.
exactly.
They had their bank accounts full and they didn't really, their money bags were full. They didn't know how to really trust God in those areas of life. Yeah, that's good too. Paul said to the Ephesian elders at Miletus when he gathered them, and they cried over him because he said that I'll probably never see your faces again. In fact, he said that the Holy Spirit told me that I'm going to go, I'm going to be captured, and I'm not going to see you all anymore. And he tells them that while I was here, I coveted no one's silver or gold or clothing, but that I've earned my own way. He was a tent maker there, and that was kind of the way in which he met some people and made connections also. But he wanted them to know that this is going to maybe rough for some of the elders there. For the elders at Miletus is not as bad as Macedonia, but still it's kind of bad. So for them to receive funds from other people, the people of Miletus, Paul was making them know that this isn't going to be, money's not going to be your ultimate trust fund. It's not going to be the thing in which you're going to put all of your trust and all of your hope in, because it may not be there. And continuing on in this chapter, going down from verse 19 and really going to the end, Paul says, "For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I might share with them in its blessings." And then he uses these amazing athletic terms. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, which in their time in the what he's referring to in the Isthmian games, they would receive it for a wreath that is made of celery. And you would just tie these celery pieces, and so it would last, a day or two, something like that at the most. But that was a big thing in their time. I mean, they only have photography, so it's not like you can snap someone a picture of it and then keep it. No, oh, there we go, I printed it up. But you receive that for winning this Isthmian games, and then it's gone the next day. But they did all of that self-discipline. All you have is boasting rights, I guess. You did all of this for the self-discipline and beating your body and going throughout this hard amount of work just to receive that crown made of celery. So Paul says, but they do it for a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly, I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. That's strong. He says that he made himself a servant of all. We don't like to think of ourselves, at least I know I wouldn't like to think of myself as a servant of people. That would be difficult, I think. Especially, translated as servant's a little bit nicer, rather than saying slave. Paul said, I've made myself a slave to all people, so that way I can win them over. Now, there was a limit to how far he was contextualizing, because he wasn't willing to do anything that caused sin or to cause others to stumble. We read that in the way in which he did ministry, and even the way that he did receive certain funds from people. But you can see how he practiced ministry, because how he was on Mars Hill preaching to the Athenians, he goes to those people. He doesn't relate to them in a Jewish way, even though he seems as though he had more than enough reason to be able to. But he goes to the context of them and quotes their pagan philosophers. He says, I see you have statues to name to all of their gods, but the one that you have to an unknown God, I'm going to teach you about him. But when he goes to a Jewish context, he goes to the synagogue, and then he reasons to them from the Old Testament scriptures. He contextualized pretty well. When he was among Gentiles, he acted as a Gentile. When he's among Jews, he acted as a Jew, without involving any form of sin. That's why he says, not taking myself outside of the law of Christ, but under the law, which they would have understood the dietary laws and the following of certain festivities. So Paul uses this imagery. He says, I have made myself a servant of all, so that way I can save just a few people, or save as many as possible. Now, I love the imagery that he uses from this Meadowbrook Games, which is held in Corinth for a while until it's taken. Paul draws from the idea of self-discipline and determination. No one does a race and does it undisciplined. No one enters into the Olympics by accident. No one gets up and, well, you can't even enter into it like that, but even if you could, no one gets up from sitting off their lazy boy, eating a bag of donuts and says, you know what, I think I'm going to go do the Olympics tomorrow. That sounds pretty fun. No one enters that way. You do it by self-discipline. You do it by a lot of sacrifice. Paul applies the same vigor towards serving Christ and towards serving people. The example I like to think of is possibly one of the greatest athletes of our time, Michael Phelps. And he's a swimmer, athletic swimmer. There was this commercial that he did with Under Armour. And the commercial shows him getting up super early in the morning. I think it's like 4 or 3:30 or something. And he gets up real early. He goes alone at this great Olympic pool, and he swims and he swims and swims and swims. And he's freezing sometimes, and it shows him go through some of these painful experiences, but a lot of discipline. And the words on the screen that after it's finally done, and then by the time he's done, it's like noon or something. But it says that what you do in the dark will get you in the light. And I thought of that, and there's that video, which is pretty moving to me. And then there's the video of him and his girlfriend, now fiance, maybe they're married now, I don't know. But watching it with the CEO of Under Armour, and they're watching it, his fiance or girlfriend at the time was weeping. And the CEO asked her, why are you weeping? And she said, it's just so beautiful because I know how much he sacrificed, and I could be proud of him because of all of these medals that he's won. He broke record after record. He's won 28, at the time that I last studied this, he won 28 Olympic medals, and 23 of them were in gold, which is amazing. And then he, right off the bat, broke record after record after record. And I think, to my knowledge, most of them are still, there might be a few that's broken by now, but he said a lot of them that will probably be in the books for quite a while. And all of that discipline, his girlfriend said that just knowing that he went through all of that, and knowing how much pain he went through, and then coming out on the other end, being as victorious as he is. And that stuck with me. And so I did a little bit of research of what his regimen was like. What do you have to do to be that disciplined, to be that good in the Olympic Games? I mean, this is not just an average game. This is not just him swimming to beat himself. And, Guinness World Records, they come and they get it. This is the Olympics. This is world championships. Well, he gets up very early in the morning. He eats about 12,000 calories a day. He swims about 50 miles a day. He trains 5 to 6 hours a day, 6 days a week, sometimes 7 days a week. And his trainer says that if he after all of that consuming, if he didn't consume, he says he doesn't watch what he eats. He eats pizzas, burgers, about anything that has a lot of calories. He doesn't watch too much what he eats because he says he doesn't have to worry about it because he burns all of that out swimming. 6 hours a day, 6 to 7 days a week, yeah, you probably just burn all that. And his trainer says that if he didn't consume that much, he would lose about 5 to 10 pounds a week. And he would just go down to about nothing if he just continued that and didn't eat all of that. I like to think that Paul had some idea of that. I don't know what rigorous training those in this Meadowbrook Games had, but I imagine they had some pretty rigorous training schedules. I like to think that Paul had that in mind whenever he's saying that same form that we have, that passion towards serving Christ, that passion towards serving other people, towards serving in his church. The passion that goes behind it is not something that's accidental. People don't receive prizes accidentally. They don't receive prizes for just being in there. And there is the Boston Marathon, there was a lady who got in trouble for actually getting on the bus and then finding a route to go around and then getting to the end of it. And then they timed how fast your heart is beating and everything like that, and you're sweating. They said, well, this is weird. I mean, she won, but she's not sweating that much. And the other people who are way back, they sweated quite profusely. And also, her heart beating isn't that fast. And so they finally looked into it, and she admitted, yeah, she cheated. But there's these people that do studies of the Boston Marathon, and I guess there's this chip that goes behind these vests. And it passes by, and there was this one gentleman who had actually took his wife's chip as well, and it showed that they passed shortly after with each other, but they cheated doing another route just like that lady did. But cheaters never win. Somewhere down the road, eventually, after they won that prize, they were always found out. Amazingly enough, there's these people that do these timings, they study these people. Sounds a little stalkerish to me, a little creepy, but they do it. And they find cheaters in these marathons. And they find out, when it really matters. It's not just like a fundraiser or something. But they find these cheaters. And you don't get to heaven by accident. We get to heaven because of Christ. We get to heaven because of what he's done for us. We don't get to heaven because we just feel as though we're good enough or because we're accidentally there. There is no such thing as accident Christians. Just a few closing comments. We should be mindful of how we can open up doors for the gospel to be heard to someone we know. What is it in the way in which we can allow ourselves to open up ourselves to other people without compromise, but to push something that's non-essential off? How can we, as a church, learn to push off non-essential items off the table for the sake of someone's salvation? Because if we're fighting something over something that's non-essential, if it's non-essential to God, it really should be non-essential to us. And lastly, how can we push aside disturbing or distracting things that steer us away from running that race that's set before us? We should always run as we ought to run. We want to get to that race, and we want to get to it well. It's not those who start off well that receive the prize, but it's those who finish well.